They thought harassing a 91-year-old veteran would be easy, until they realized someone far more dangerous was watching. Sun Valley, Kansas, was a small, quiet town where nothing much ever seemed to happen. Tucked away from the bustle of big cities, it was a place where folks knew each other by name and greeted one another with a smile as they passed on the street. The houses here were old, some of them dating back to the early 1900s, with faded brick walls and yards filled with flower beds or well-maintained lawns. Children ran around the neighborhood in the late afternoons, their laughter echoing in the crisp open air. For the most part, life moved at its own gentle pace. The town's centerpiece was a little diner on Main Street, the kind where locals gathered every morning for coffee and gossip. The owners, John and Mary, knew exactly how much sugar everyone liked in their coffee, and they never failed to ask about your kids or your grandkids. It was a world where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. People came and went, but there was always an unspoken promise that things would stay the same. And then there was Sam Johnson, who had lived in Sun Valley for as long as anyone could remember. At 91 years old, Sam was a fixture in the town, his name spoken with the same respect reserved for the town's founding fathers. He lived in a modest house on Elm Street, just a few blocks away from the diner. It was a house that had seen more than its fair share of history. His history, the kind that was marked by sacrifice and the weight of a life well lived. Sam had been a soldier, a man who had served in World War II and had lived to tell the tales. He had fought on the front lines, seen his comrades fall, and returned home with a sense of pride that only veterans seem to carry. But that pride wasn't always visible in the way he lived now. Over the years, Sam had grown quieter. His movements were slower, his back stiff from the years of marching, and his eyes, once sharp and full of life, had softened with time. His house was a reflection of him, a little worn at the edges but still full of character. The faded flag of the United States hung proudly on the front porch, and his flower garden, though overrun with weeds these days, still held remnants of the beauty it once had. His rocking chair sat on the porch, weathered and creaky, just like him. But even in his older years, Sam's spirit hadn't faded. He still walked every morning, though it was slower now, with the help of a cane, down the same street he had walked as a young man. He wasn't quick to ask for help, but he never hesitated to offer it when someone needed it. For all that Sam had given, for all the battles he had fought in the past, he never imagined that the most difficult challenge he would face would come in the form of three young men who thought they could get away with anything. As he sat on his porch that morning, his fingers tracing the edge of the cane beside him, Sam didn't sense the change yet. He didn't know it, but the calm he had come to rely on was about to be shattered. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden light across the street. There was no wind, no rustling of the trees. Everything was still. And for Sam, that was just the way he liked it. He sat back in his chair, content to watch the world go by, completely unaware of the threat that was slowly creeping toward him. But in the distance, something was shifting, and it would soon make itself known. It was just after noon when the first sign of trouble appeared. A sound broke the stillness, a loud grinding engine noise that wasn't typical for the quiet town. Sam's eyes flicked toward the street, his gaze sharp as ever, even if his body didn't quite keep pace with it anymore. A weathered, rusty van pulled onto Elm Street, its engine sputtering as if it had barely made the journey. The van was old, too old, and the paint was peeling, leaving patches of faded blue and gray. It was the kind of vehicle that looked out of place in Sun Valley, where most people drove clean, well-kept cars, or at least vehicles that didn't seem like they had been abandoned on the side of the road for years. The van rolled to a stop just in front of Sam's house. The tires crunched loudly against the gravel, the noise making Sam's eyebrows knit together in concern. This wasn't a delivery truck, nor was it a vehicle that belonged to any of the locals. Sam had lived in this town long enough to recognize every car, every truck, and every face. This wasn't one of his neighbors. That much was clear. Three men climbed out of the van, each moving with a sense of purpose that didn't sit well with Sam. They weren't here for a friendly visit. No, these men looked like trouble from the moment they stepped onto the road. The first one, the tallest of the bunch, had a shaved head and tattoos snaking up his neck. His muscles bulged from the sleeves of his torn t-shirt, and he moved with the arrogance of someone who thought the world owed him something. The second man was stockier, his hair messy and unkempt. He wore a leather jacket even though it was warm outside, and his posture gave off a sense of casual menace. He kept glancing around as if he were already scouting for trouble. The third man was the quietest, his expression blank, eyes narrowed as he watched the surroundings. He wasn't interested in small talk. He was here to do a job, and he made no effort to hide that fact. They made their way toward Sam's house, not bothering to speak to anyone else on the street, their focus entirely on the old man sitting on the porch. Sam had seen enough to know that their intentions were far from friendly. His fingers twitched toward the rifle beside him, but he stopped himself. He wasn't quick to pull the trigger, not without understanding the situation first. The tall man led the group, a grin spreading across his face as he approached the porch. "Hey there, old man," he called, his voice carrying the same tone Sam had heard from the younger generation far too often, disrespectful, entitled. "Got a little business with you." Sam didn't flinch. He simply stared at the man, his eyes cold and calculating. He wasn't going to let anyone push him around, not in his own town, not even when they thought they could get away with it. "Do I know you?" Sam's voice was gravelly but firm, his years of experience letting him keep his composure. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd rattled him. The tall man didn't answer at first. Instead, he glanced at his companions, a look passing between them before he turned back to Sam. "You're Sam Johnson, right? You fought in the war. We know all about you." Sam's heart skipped a beat. He didn't like where this was going. He hadn't been in the business of making enemies in this town, but he wasn't foolish enough to think his reputation wasn't known. "That's right," Sam said slowly, his fingers now wrapped tightly around the cane, his grip steady. "And you are?" The tall man smirked, stepping closer. "Doesn't matter. What matters is that you owe us. You've got something we need." Sam's pulse quickened. He didn't recognize these men, but it was clear they were here for something. And the more they spoke, the more he realized they weren't interested in a polite conversation or a friendly request. But what Sam didn't know yet was that someone had been watching, and the real danger had yet to reveal itself. As the thugs closed in on Sam, there was a figure in the distance who was far more aware of what was happening than anyone else. Hidden in the shadows of a thick grove of oak trees, Rambo stood motionless, his eyes locked on the men across the street. His face was partially obscured by the leaves, but his gaze was piercing, as if he could see every movement, every twitch, every glance between the thugs. He had learned long ago to watch before acting, one of the most valuable lessons from his time in combat. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet street. But Rambo didn't mind. He had been here for hours, waiting, watching. He had noticed the van pull into town earlier that morning, its presence lingering in the back of his mind. His instincts had kicked in when it parked outside Sam's house. No one came to Sun Valley unless they had a reason, and when the van door opened, Rambo knew something was wrong. Rambo was no stranger to danger. His military days had taught him how to read a situation, how to understand who the real threat was, how to calculate his next move. He had served in countless operations where lives were on the line, where seconds could mean the difference between life and death. He had seen brutality, and he had seen the way men like those in the van operated, unpredictable, ruthless, and willing to take anything from anyone. But he also knew something else, that there were times when you couldn't just stand by and let it happen. And this was one of those times. Rambo's hands were steady as he crouched behind the trees, his old body moving with a practiced ease that only someone who had spent years on the front lines could manage. The rifle at his side was old, but it had been well cared for, much like its owner. His instincts had been honed over decades of service, and they hadn't dulled over time. Through the scope he could see the tension on Sam's face, the way the old man's eyes flicked nervously from one thug to the next. But Sam didn't make any moves. He wasn't the kind of man to give in easily. The leader of the group, the man with the tattoos, leaned closer to Sam, his voice low but filled with aggression. "I don't think you understand, old man. We're not asking. You're going to give us what we want, or things are going to get ugly." Sam didn't respond. His hands remained on his cane, but his jaw clenched. He had lived through enough hard times in his life to know that there was no talking these men down. They were here for something, and they wouldn't leave until they got it. Rambo's grip tightened around his rifle. His heart rate slowed, his mind clicking into the familiar mode of a soldier. He didn't need to ask questions. He didn't need to know exactly what was going on. All he needed to know was that Sam, an elderly war veteran, was in danger. That was all the reason he needed. The thugs were pushing harder now. One of them had stepped forward, getting right up in Sam's face. Sam didn't flinch, but Rambo could see the strain in his eyes. These men weren't afraid of him, but they didn't know who was watching. In the distance, Rambo's finger hovered over the trigger. He wasn't there to kill. He wasn't there to make the first move. He was there to stop this, before it went too far. But as the thugs grew bolder, Rambo realized that the moment to act was fast approaching. The tension between the thugs and Sam was palpable. The leader, now standing just a few feet away, looked like he was daring Sam to make a move. The others stood behind him, watching, eager for a confrontation. Sam, however, remained unmoved, his eyes locked on the tall thug in front of him. His fingers gripped his cane a little tighter, the faintest hint of steel in his gaze. He wasn't afraid, not for a second. "Old man," the leader growled, taking a step closer, his breath heavy with the smell of cigarette smoke. "You don't want this to get ugly. Just hand over what we're asking for, and no one gets hurt." Sam didn't respond. His eyes flicked over the thug's shoulder, his mind calculating. He wasn't sure what these men wanted, but the way they spoke, the way they carried themselves. It wasn't a simple request. Sam knew these were men who thought they could take anything they wanted, no questions asked. They didn't care who they hurt in the process. It wasn't the first time Sam had seen this kind of arrogance. He'd been there in the heat of battle, facing off against enemies who thought they could win by sheer force. But Sam wasn't the kind of man who let fear rule him. Not anymore. And he wouldn't back down now either. The thugs were growing impatient. The stocky one, who had been standing silently behind the leader, reached into his jacket, his movements slow but deliberate. Sam's grip tightened on his cane, his eyes narrowing. He could sense that the situation was about to escalate. That's when it happened. A rustle from the shadows. A figure stepped into the open, silent as a ghost. It was so quick that the thugs barely had time to react. Rambo moved like a predator, quiet, deliberate, and calculated. His presence was sudden and overwhelming. The first thug, who had been inching toward Sam, froze when he heard the rustling of leaves behind him. He turned just in time to see a large, muscular figure emerging from the trees. The tall thug, who had been so sure of his position, found himself face to face with Rambo in an instant. He stumbled back in shock, his eyes wide as Rambo's shadow fell over him like a storm cloud. The leader opened his mouth to speak, but before a word could leave his lips, Rambo's voice cut through the air like a knife. "You're not welcome here," Rambo said, his voice low but filled with authority. The words hit the thug like a slap, and for a moment the street fell completely silent. Sam watched, his heart racing, as the thugs processed the unexpected turn of events. The leader's eyes flicked between Rambo and Sam. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being the one on the back foot. "Who the hell are you?" the thug spat, his bravado faltering for the first time. Rambo didn't flinch. He took a step forward, his presence undeniable. "Someone who's not afraid to stop you from making a mistake," he said simply. He didn't raise his fists, didn't make a move to threaten them directly. He didn't need to. His posture, his gaze, his very presence, it all spoke volumes. The second thug, the one who had been silent until now, moved to intercept. He lunged forward, his hand reaching for something in his jacket, but Rambo was faster. With a swift, calculated motion, he blocked the thug's arm and drove his elbow into the man's ribs. The thug gasped, crumpling to the ground in pain, unable to keep his footing. Rambo was methodical in his actions, precise as ever, his military instincts taking over. Sam watched, wide-eyed, as Rambo continued to take control of the situation. It was like watching a dance, a dangerous, calculated waltz where Rambo led and the thugs were left trying to catch up. The third thug, the quiet one, hesitated for a moment, eyeing the situation. He had seen his companions taken down so effortlessly, and the realization was dawning on him that they were out of their league. But the leader wasn't ready to admit defeat. "We're not leaving without what we came for," the leader snarled, his eyes burning with anger. He reached for something in his pocket, but Rambo was already moving. With a speed that belied his age, he seized the thug's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing the man to his knees. "You're leaving now," Rambo said coldly, his grip tightening, "and you're never coming back." For a brief moment, the leader's defiance wavered, his face flushed with humiliation. The other two thugs, defeated and sprawled on the ground, didn't make a sound. They knew their fight was over. Rambo stepped back, giving the leader one final push, sending him sprawling on the gravel. "Get up," he muttered, his voice a low growl. The leader scrambled to his feet, his eyes now filled with something else, fear. For the first time, he was the one being hunted. The thugs didn't wait another second. They scrambled to their feet, their expressions filled with confusion and anger, but there was no fight left in them. Without another word, they turned and fled, disappearing down the street with their tails between their legs. Sam, still sitting on his porch, let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the arm of his chair, but there was no fear in his eyes, only relief. Rambo, meanwhile, stood silently for a moment watching the thugs retreat. He didn't say a word, just turned and walked toward Sam's porch, his movements calm and deliberate. But even though the danger had passed, Sam knew one thing for sure. Today was a reminder that heroes didn't always wear uniforms. The street was quiet again, but the air still carried the weight of what had just happened. The three men were gone, their heavy footsteps fading into the distance as they ran. No, fled, out of Sun Valley, their pride left scattered across Sam's yard. Their rusty van sat abandoned where they had left it, its open door swinging slightly in the wind, a reminder of their failed attempt at intimidation. Sam exhaled slowly, his grip loosening on his cane. He had been prepared to stand his ground, to fight if it came down to it. But Rambo had made sure that wasn't necessary. The fight had ended before it ever truly began, because that's what men like Rambo did. They stopped things before they could get worse. Sam pushed himself to his feet, his joints stiff but still strong. He eyed Rambo, who stood a few feet away, his arms relaxed at his sides, but his posture still alert. Always watching, always assessing. There was something about the way he carried himself that told Sam this wasn't the first time he had dealt with men like that, and it wouldn't be the last. Rambo turned his head slightly, watching as the van's door creaked back and forth. His expression was unreadable, his breathing steady, as if what had just happened was nothing more than routine. And maybe for him it was. "You didn't have to do that," Sam finally said, his voice steady but filled with quiet gratitude. "I've handled worse before." Rambo didn't respond right away. He simply studied Sam for a moment, taking in the deep lines on his face, the scars of time that no battlefield could ever replicate. There was respect in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement between two men who had lived through wars. Different battles, maybe, but wars all the same. "I know," Rambo said eventually, his voice low, "but you shouldn't have to." There was a pause between them, not awkward, not heavy, just understanding. Two men, both warriors in their own right, standing on the same ground, neither needing to explain themselves to the other. Sam let out a rough chuckle, shaking his head. "You always were a stubborn one." Rambo smirked, but it was brief, barely noticeable. "Some things never change." The old man glanced back at his porch, at the chair that had been his place of comfort for years. But today, it felt different. Today, it wasn't just a place to sit. It was a reminder that peace is never guaranteed. Not even in Sun Valley. "You were watching, weren't you?" Sam asked, looking back at Rambo. Rambo nodded slightly. "Saw the van this morning. Knew it didn't belong." Sam sighed, rubbing his temple. Wish I'd been paying closer attention. Getting old, I guess. You're not getting old, Rambo said. They were just too young to know who they were messing with. That made Sam chuckle again, this time louder. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled pack of cigarettes. He didn't smoke much anymore, but today felt like a day to make an exception. He lit one and took a slow drag, staring off toward the road where the thugs had vanished. What do you think they wanted? He asked, though the question felt almost irrelevant now. Rambo shrugged. Doesn't matter. They won't be back. And they wouldn't. Rambo hadn't needed to say much to make sure of that. Men like those only understood one thing: power. And today they learned they weren't the ones who had it. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the scent of fresh grass and warm earth. The evening was settling in, and the town was returning to its normal rhythm. A car drove by, its driver giving Sam a quick wave, unaware of what had just taken place. The world kept moving, as it always did. Sam took another slow drag of his cigarette, then glanced at Rambo. You sticking around? Rambo tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. For a little while. That was enough for Sam. He nodded, sinking back into his chair. The danger had passed, but something told him this wouldn't be the last time trouble came knocking. The world had changed since he was young, and not for the better. But for today, at least, Sun Valley was safe, because someone was still watching. The sun was beginning to set over Sun Valley, its warm glow stretching long shadows across the cracked pavement. The quiet hum of life resumed as if nothing had happened, as if a storm hadn't just passed through Sam's front yard and been chased away by a man who had seen more battles than anyone in this town could ever imagine. Rambo stood at the edge of the porch, his stance relaxed but still exuding an unshakable presence. He was a man who had never truly stopped being a soldier, just one who had learned to pick his battles more carefully. Sam took a final drag of his cigarette, exhaling slowly as he watched the smoke rise into the evening air. You know, people used to look out for each other, he said, his voice softer now, less burdened by the adrenaline of the last hour. Didn't matter who you were. If someone needed help, you stepped up. These days? Feels like folks just look the other way. Rambo didn't respond right away. Instead, he let the words settle, watching as the last bit of sunlight slipped below the horizon. Then he spoke. They don't look away because they don't care, he said. They look away because they're scared. Sam turned his head slightly, studying the man standing beside him. There was truth in Rambo's words, truth that was hard to swallow. Fear. That was what had changed. It wasn't that people had lost their sense of right and wrong. It was that they had lost the belief that standing up for what was right was worth the cost. But today, Rambo had reminded them. From across the street, a woman was peeking through her curtains, watching them. A few houses down, a father and son sat on their porch, the young boy still pointing toward Sam's house, asking questions in hushed tones. People had seen what happened today, and more importantly, they had seen who had put an end to it. You think they'll come back? Sam asked, his voice even. Rambo shook his head. Not these ones. Sam nodded, satisfied. He knew what Rambo meant. It wouldn't be these same thugs, but there would always be others. The world had a way of cycling through men who took what they wanted, thinking no one would stop them. And that was why men like Rambo still existed. After a long moment, Sam pushed himself up from his chair. He winced slightly as his knees protested, but he refused to show weakness. You ever think about settling down? He asked, his tone casual, though there was meaning behind it. Sticking around for good? Rambo smirked faintly. Not my style. Sam chuckled. Didn't think so. The two men stood there for a moment side by side, watching as Sun Valley slowly faded into night. The streetlights flickered on, casting a dim glow over the pavement. The town had gone back to its quiet way of life, but something was different now. Tonight, people would talk. Tonight, they would remember that when trouble came knocking, someone answered. And maybe, just maybe, the next time something like this happened, someone else in town would be willing to stand up too. Sam let out a deep sigh, shaking his head. Hell of a way to spend an afternoon. Rambo gave him a sideways glance. Better than wasting it. Sam laughed at that. A real laugh this time. Yeah, I suppose it is. Rambo turned slightly, as if considering whether to leave or stay a little longer. The town was quiet again, but he knew what Sam knew. Peace was never permanent. But as long as he was here, at least for now, Sun Valley would be just a little safer. Because some men never stop being soldiers, and some battles are fought long after the war is over. If you believe in standing up for what's right, in looking out for those who can't always fight for themselves, then don't be afraid to be that person. The world needs more people willing to take a stand. Subscribe for more real, powerful stories that remind us that courage isn't just found in movies. It's found in the choices we make every day.